What's the deal with Kingdom?
When we think of video games, marketing and advertising is usually never at the top of mind for us gamers. The medium has also been saturated with brand names and franchises with a consistent following. First impressions for a video game release can be directly inferred from seeing the name of the company that develops or publishes it. It's why marketing seems unnecessary at times once there is a cult following, yet from a business standpoint might not even scratch the surface. Role-playing games and other single players are hardly the biggest profit makers in this modern industry with microtransactions. To an extent,
very smart decision, Square Enix.
These games will be a short-term burst of sales, maybe add some downloadable content and re-releases until they need to develop new games with larger development costs. That is why if any game needs good marketing, it's the console exclusives, the single-player campaigns and RPGs. Even then, any business needs to market their products. But how about in the late 90s and early 2000s, the beginnings of huge franchises like Metroid or Super Smash Bros., when YouTube or Twitter didn't even exist and when video games were an extremely niche form of entertainment. Marketing such a product is not an easy task with limited resources, especially when they're entirely new games. The audience that they want to invite could be locked within cultural preferences as video games weren't always globalized. And this was a heightened period for the competition that took place within Japan's video game industry, dominating the sales and exposure even when most Japanese games weren't even localized to the large markets. And Square was its own company with a pool of competitors. Navigating through this atmosphere with upcoming new technologies in game development requires a good deal of collaboration and understanding of consoles, audiences, and the bigger market. How this process ultimately led to Square's partnership with Disney to sell a game using elements from the West and their unique style of an RPG. What made the game a huge success, sustaining its legacy for more than 2 decades, making it the household name when anyone is referring to a Disney game. This is the marketing success of Kingdom Hearts. And since we're diving into Kingdom Hearts and someone's name always pops up, we can't go on without properly introducing the man who directed the series. Credited for designing characters in major Square Enix titles, Tetsuya Nomura is an influential giant in the JRPG scene, inspiring other developers and designers in making memorable characters, creating the basis of how JRPG characters look. For better or worse, despite being widely known for his role in Kingdom Hearts, he has tapped into a variety of properties that have shaped the Square Enix brand, mostly in the character design role, but had pitched some of his own ideas into various other stories. What made him into this designing role began way early into his life. Nomura was an avid drawer as a kid, doing the normal doodles before trying to make his own manga that he shared with his friends when he was a teenager. It was when he was drawing his manga that his art teacher, impressed by Nomura's skills, suggested that he should take a closer look at a franchise called Final Fantasy, pointing towards the main illustrator for the franchise at the time, Yoshitaka Amano. Even as Final Fantasy was huge in Japan, Nomura had not been a long-time player of video games, unrecognized at first to the drawings of Amano. The first game that captivated Nomura was Dragon Quest, developed by Enix. He was surprised of the detailed stories and broad worlds that can exist within video games, but even through the years, Nomura had no intention of joining a game company, rather sticking to his passion for drawing, attending a vocational school where he began to pursue his love for drawing by affiliating it towards print advertisements, which was the creative and more streamlined form of advertising in the 90s. Though he may not be an advertiser today, Nomura still has the mindset in applying strategies to market towards an audience. But back then, his aspects for a profession changed when he discovered a job advertisement in an employment magazine, an open position by a company named Square with illustrations by a familiar name, Yoshitaka Amano. Remembering how he was first introduced to Amano's work by his art teacher a while ago, Nomura was eager for a chance at the gig, disregarding his initial career prospect of possibly working in an advertisement company, stating that he just wanted a job where he could make something while being able to draw. And from that one opportunity, the rest is history. Jumping into the time when Kingdom Hearts started development includes some hurdles of history that influenced its design, its marketing, and its direction. And it started Nomura's first contributions at Square. Nomura's initial role in his new job in 1990 began in a minimal way. Before taking the helm to design characters for consequential video games, he initially worked as a debugger and playtester for Final Fantasy IV. Not until Final Fantasy V when he had a hand into doing the monster designs for that game, a turning point with Nomura's role in Square. Nomura had great respect for Tetsuya Takahashi, who would later leave Square to start his own company, Monolith Soft, in the collaboration of Namco and down the line Nintendo, creating games like the Xenoblade Chronicles franchise. The reasoning for Takahashi's departure from Square was particularly the idea that much attention was going to be placed on the Final Fantasy series, which started complication about his passion to work for other games that weren't Final Fantasy. But when he was still part of the company, he became the main mentor for Nomura in the development of Final Fantasy V, creating a mutual friendship that would pay off in the distant future. After Final Fantasy V, rose Nomura up to the ranks of working as part of the graphic design team alongside Yoshitaka Amano for Final Fantasy VI. But the main spotlight for Nomura shined along with one of Square's most successful and important titles, Final Fantasy VII, popularizing Nomura's role inside Square. This time, Nomura had picked up on the role as the main character designer for the game, a position held highly in the previous games by Yoshitaka Amano, the man who did the illustration in that job ad that made Nomura join the company in the first place. How the roles have shifted from Amano to Nomura is much due to the conditions of how video games were being transformed. With newer technologies, inventions, and creative ideas, the next step of gaming was in this era. But Amano was known for his abstract, expressive illustrations, emphasizing great detail on every strain of hair and fabric. Illustrations like the Warrior of Light in Final Fantasy I, Firion in Final Fantasy II, an Art Nouveau style. But with the vision to develop the franchise's first three-dimensional graphic design with visualized motion video, a next step with less pixelation and more polygonal, they needed a designer who could create characters that weren't too complicated when rendering it into a game, and it seems belts and zippers weren't complications. Consequently, became Nomura's position as character designer, with the emphasis of creating characters suitable for next-gen games, creating gaming's most iconic characters and artwork in an internationally recognized title, kickstarting his future goals of making character designs for many other games. And the man really loves drawing. And this direction for the Final Fantasy franchise wouldn't have happened without one decision that changed the trajectory of 7's development, of the franchise's three-dimensional game designs, and probably Nomura's position as character designer. A decision that recognized the game to the West and internationally, holding this game and Square's reputation for the future. Hinorobu Sakaguchi, the creator of the Final Fantasy franchise, wanted 7 to be the biggest step in the series, exhausting a ton of resources for the graphics team and its music direction. Through the development of this new entry, Square had shifted its console publisher from Nintendo to Sony. This was a move that Sakaguchi convinced the higher-ups at Square to execute, citing the primary reason of how the Nintendo 64 cartridges can't handle the 3D graphics and memory size Final Fantasy VII was aiming for, and some communication struggles between the two companies. It looked like a very sudden separation when the successful Super Mario RPG, a co-development with Square and Nintendo, was released less than a year before Final Fantasy VII. But when the decision to move to Sony was approved, Sakaguchi casually announced to the dev team that their work with Nintendo was over. Nomura recalling how the encounter played out, with Sakaguchi surprising him by wearing a PlayStation jumper jacket. During this period of a new partnership as well as a new phase into the console war, establishing the product to the market was a huge influence in finding the unique identities of these two companies, especially with Sony taking the helm to localize the games to the West, which Nintendo previously did for Square. It required a good idea and relationship for this collaboration to work out, not just for Square, but more particularly for Sony, for gamers to see the capabilities and limitations of this new console for future games, and this partnership would influence the development cycle for other successful Final Fantasy games, and eventually Kingdom Hearts. Final Fantasy VII was a major addition to a decade-long franchise at the time, to be released on Sony's first PlayStation. Gamers around the world may even find it the first time they discover a Final Fantasy game due to the lack of localization for previous titles. So the franchise name on itself isn't going to be enough to attract a large sum of the new worldwide audience. It is without a doubt that Final Fantasy VII had to raise its sales when coming into this gaming atmosphere and a new partnership. The PlayStation didn't have a long recognizable name as compared to Nintendo or Sega. This would become a marketing challenge for both Sony and Square to sell a relatively new console and a console exclusive game. And as you might know, Final Fantasy VII was a major marketing success of its own, being the second best-selling game for the PlayStation. With their partner Sony, they had invested one of the largest budgets for marketing using 1990s money, estimating roughly $40 to $100 million. But how do you market a franchise's new take on video game design in a different console? A marketing associate for the Squaresoft division in the United States, Hyogo Higo, said that the best way to market Final Fantasy VII was to show off the cinematic quality of the game, marketing it like a blockbuster feature, a strategy of showing instead of describing, especially due to the complex story of FF7. David Bamberger, marketing manager of Sony, said that the game was, quote, the one that we felt would help define what our hardware is. He also acknowledged how the disconnect in genre outside of Japan would pose a risk in marketing the game, but that didn't shy away from the studio investing millions marketing it. Thankfully, Bamberger had documented the marketing strategy for Final Fantasy VII, which we can use to gain some insight to what goes on behind the scenes when marketing a major release in the 90s, before social media and big events like E3 being very recent. The first thing we see documented are the sales expectations for the games that were set to release. When Square's sales expectations were expectations. Included were Final Fantasy Tactics and Saga Frontier. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy VII had a sales expectation of a mere 750,000. Little would they know that the outcome after this marketing would exceed 10 times that expectation. It also includes the need to create awareness between the two brands. The fanbase of Square had originally been through Nintendo, probably owning Nintendo consoles before the PlayStation since every previous title was released for Nintendo's console, and therefore Sony had to close the gap to indulge the fanbase into their device. The document would also lay out the marketing timeline for the game, the events to promote and the advertising they would want to execute. Other than that, it emphasizes in knowing what the gaming atmosphere was back then, analyzing what gamers wanted to see, and the competitive factors between other releases like Legend of Zelda's Ocarina of Time on the N64. This type of situational analysis is a common compartment to any product even if it's not in the gaming industry, sometimes more important than large budget ads. And this one is probably the simplest of concept to understand without diving too much about marketing. This analysis consists of 4 significant terms to help visualize the marketing strategy: the strengths of the brand or product, its weaknesses, the opportunities they can take, and finally the threats, which would be your competitors and other disruption. To us, it can be a very subconscious analysis whenever we see a trailer or box art in today's world. What brand is the game part of? Whether the release dates are very close to another major game, or if it's going to be overshadowed by other trailers if it were to be marketed at big events. As for Final Fantasy VII, it needed to take both brands into account, Sony and Square. The advantages that Square had long produced notable acclaimed games on the condition that it was in Nintendo's console, which includes as a significant weakness. The franchise's 3D game design would be considered an opportunity, and finally the threats of other video game releases. You can punch in any recent game to analyze accordingly, which would be more detailed once you've got the internet and social media. With that analysis, even Sony themselves needed to market outstandingly for their own brand. Yoshihiro Murayama, Executive Vice President of Square in the US division, said that Sony was struggling with their competitions, Sega and Nintendo, that they really wanted to publish Square's titles in America as well as in Europe.
Always was. And now, the most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you. Final Fantasy VII.
And there began the marketing campaign of Final Fantasy VII, heavily prioritizing the North American demographic, investing in 30-second ads on channels like MTV and ESPN, commercials in popular and highly touted shows like Late Night with Conan O'Brien and Saturday Night Live, showing the cinematics of the game, being publicized in print advertisements for popular magazines like the Rolling Stones as well as the comics by DC and Marvel. They also worked together with Pepsi with a promotional cup and cardboard cutouts to raise its outreach beyond the magazines and television commercials. This was a weird marketing stunt with needing a proof of purchase to get these rewards, but marketing is marketing. And hey, if you feel betrayed that Square collaborated with Pepsi, fret not because they also did one with Coca-Cola. You get Cloud flexing with Pepsi and Tidus with your Coke. The history of Final Fantasy VII's success is a clear playbook in marketing, advertising towards a broad range of ages instead of sticking to the young ones with their choices of commercials, being the second best-selling PlayStation game for what was Square's second ever game to be released on the PlayStation. It exceeded every previous Final Fantasy title and essentially established the PlayStation as a console. Some might even say Final Fantasy VII was Sony's ticket to success for their console and Square's most important game to rise globally. Nintendo and even Sega has marketed themselves to a different level beyond what Sony and Final Fantasy VII had done. Celebrity endorsements and collaboration, even advertising to retailers to advertise to buyers.
And all of this helps salespeople serve customers better and faster.
Sega was trying to reach out to the European market that might have a close correlation to the Dreamcast console and their interactive games appearing in jerseys in football matches, though that deal will sadly lead to the decline due to the cost of arranging it without gaining much traction, seizing the Dreamcast not long after. Celebrity sponsorships aren't gonna be your best strategy, while marketing isn't as easy as putting a famous face with your company's name on it. But as we increasingly approach the 2000s, you can see a common trend with these Japanese gaming companies. They see the invested gamers in the international community, a prime opportunity for Japan to be a global player in video games. Even in television, anime began premiering in the US, some based from games like the Dragon Quest anime, and you've got your Pokemon and Dragon Ball. The Japanese culture had expanded to these demographics in the West, and it was now a competition for the market abroad, implementing extensive investments in trying to capture this huge audience, knowing the success of games like Final Fantasy VII, Zelda, Sonic, Super Smash Bros, and Super Mario. Knowing the motivations to aim for the North American demographic and the reason for the idea of Kingdom Hearts, we could also look into game developments in the West, especially in the 2000s. American game developers were quite the underdog in the early 90s. Best-selling games and consoles were dominated by Japanese developers across the genres. The games that Western developers made still contained that similarity of category, RPGs, but with a more streamlined approach to their locals. We saw The Elder Scrolls released in 1994 by Bethesda. We had Valve's Half-Life in 1998, an influential first-person shooter game for the generations of FPS to come. Both of these commercial successes retained the role-playing aspect that is present in most Japanese games. Only difference is that they look more realistic and were released on the Microsoft desktop instead of the consoles. PC desktops can in itself be part of the equation. But what ensued next for Microsoft in 2001 is the release of the Xbox.
That's fascinating.
An expected prime contender against Sony's PlayStation. But Sony had released its brand new PlayStation 2 a year earlier. As such, with Xbox's parent company based in the US, they would have been ready to approach the North American market, accompanied by big releases like the first entry to the Halo franchise. But despite it, the PS2 still managed to outsell the Xbox, creating a window of opportunity for the best-selling franchise of that console, Grand Theft Auto, selling more than 20 million copies. These games like Half-Life, Elder Scrolls, or GTA were very well streamlined to American gamers, having a huge influence towards them in the region with their marketing and their style of design. It doesn't have those cartoonish characters and anime quirks like Mario or Link. Especially GTA, the demographics targeted can range up to the older adults, expanding their reach in the 2000s, and Rockstar continued with that strategy for future titles. This type of perspective emphasizes on how elements that are already recognized by many people will be marketed well, since it brings off a sense of familiarity to it. It deducts hesitations they might have for an entirely new product or franchise. Why games today are part of long franchises that spans for years, fans are comfortable to buy something they're familiar with. And for Kingdom Hearts to begin in 2002, the peak of the gaming industry in the global and western stance, with big competitions in franchises and consoles, and still reach the top 10 best-selling PS2 game with a new name that is not Final Fantasy, required one other company to make that magic.
What's the deal with Kingdom Hearts?
The idea of Kingdom Hearts was brought up during the development of Final Fantasy VII in a conversation between Hironobu Sakaguchi and Shinji Hashimoto, an executive director at the time. They saw the success of Mario 64, having similar three-dimensional graphics to Final Fantasy VII, but more freedom for the player to roam, and it looked to be more immersive in gameplay than turn-based RPGs. Sakaguchi and Hashimoto wanted to rival the Mario title with the plan for a similar playstyle, a type of gameplay that Square wasn't known for. For them to not use an entirely new cast of characters for this new game design was essentially its lack of popularity. And on the principle of familiarity in marketing, the plan to market a newly structured game with lesser known characters won't be as effective. To meet the standards of Mario 64 requires recognizable characters that were of the same level as Mario. And looking at what's discussed with the Western culture trends and steep competition between console titles, they look to the characters owned by Disney, one of the biggest entertainment company based in America. It was that conversation Nomura overheard and volunteered to direct such a project. Working with Disney Interactive Studios was an ambitious idea that wasn't even thought of to be possible, given Disney's high profile, and that it will be Square's first collaboration with a company that's not based in Japan. But their rationale for wanting this is quite reasonable even outside from Disney characters carrying the popularity. You see, the Japan region has always been on the top of mind for Japanese developers, while some games today would see earlier releases in Japan before the international. Meanwhile, Walt Disney World was becoming a huge thing in the West, building an amusement park with the foundation of Disney characters. Their first amusement park launched outside of America was opened in none other than Japan on the 15th of April 1983, which became very successful.
Tokyo Disneyland opens April 15th, and its backers' biggest worry is it will be too popular.
What many might not know is that Tokyo's Disney Resort isn't actually fully owned or operated by the Walt Disney Company. It is instead licensed by a Japanese leisure and tourism corporation, the Oriental Land Company, while Disney earns a percentage of their sales. Through this, they had much more freedom in the merchandise they sold and special events, like the highly demanded Kingdom Hearts hotel rooms. Using their merchandise that targeted the locals made it an immense success in profitability and basically popularized Disney's franchise in the country. Disney having their first international park in Japan made its launch very well known, and knowing the freedom the Oriental Land Company had with the licensing of Disney, Kingdom Hearts wouldn't be such a stretch of an idea to possibly get licensed and marketed to a large scale in Japan. Along with international exposure, adding Disney to the formula was a surefire way to at least gain tons of attention. The journey to collaborate with Disney involved miracles and lucky events for the ambitious project to even be authorized. Hashimoto would have that chance encounter on an elevator with a Disney executive from the Japanese branch to pitch the idea of making a game together. And as we know, it was greenlighted for the start of its development and ideas, but while it was approved in Japan, it wasn't the final stage for approval because executives who were able to make such decisions were those at the highest positions. The branch of Japan had no licensing power to approve the creation of Kingdom Hearts, and the higher-ups could shut down all development if they were to say no. While the elevator ride that kickstarted Kingdom Hearts' development was quite well known, some could overlook how Square had no idea it was not even fully approved when they already started some form of development of the game. Shuji Utsumi, the vice president for Disney in the Asia Pacific region at the time, revealed that he was tasked to fully approve Kingdom Hearts while the game was already in some form of development. He approached a bunch of other employees and executives to know for sure it has grounds for approval, and all that was left was getting it approved by the CEO of Disney back then, Michael Eisner. Though what looked like a simple final step came with a lot of nervousness for Utsumi, with a Disney staff warning him that he should prepare announcing the cancellation of the game to Square. It appears that Disney, or mostly Eisner, was incredibly strict back then for new companies to use their IPs. Even while their games were made in collaboration with other companies like Capcom, with their successful game Aladdin for the NES, it was still intimidating to approach Eisner. What became the opportune time for Utsumi to ask Eisner about Kingdom Hearts was during Eisner's visit to Japan to do what else than inspect Tokyo Disney Sea in their amusement park in Japan. It was during a meeting when Eisner wanted to receive the performance results of Disney from the Japanese branch that Utsumi presented Kingdom Hearts to Eisner. With already low expectations, Eisner wasn't too interested in what Utsumi was presenting. He gave no real praise, but told Utsumi that he should keep at it and do it right. And from those words, it was enough of an approval by Eisner even without any substantial praise, finally having the authority for Square to fully develop and publish Kingdom Hearts. Some of that strictness, however, would influence the development of the game, most notably the advisory restrictions on Square of minimizing Mickey Mouse's screen time, the main face of the Disney brand, which was the equivalent to Nintendo's Mario. And going back to Sakaguchi and Hashimoto's conversation about making a Disney game with the same popularity as Mario 64, Mickey Mouse was their idea to be the main character to reach that level thanks to its iconic popularity. Disney, however, preferred that Square, instead of Mickey, would buy into making Donald Duck the main character. And the original vision for the story was relatively simple, with Square's main goal of making a 3D game with player freedom like Mario 64 but with Disney characters. The original plot for it to be stopping a witch, which obviously referenced Maleficent later on, and the game would have ended there after defeating her without an original villain being in the game. Hinorobu Sakaguchi, before leaving Square, gave Nomura the advice to create a compelling story similar to the Final Fantasy franchise to make Kingdom Hearts successful. Even with Disney characters, the game should also appeal to Final Fantasy fans instead of mainly targeting for kids who'd likely be okay with a simple story. and also for Kingdom Hearts to not be a pure recreation of one of their movies or characters in the form of a game. And if you've seen Capcom's Mickey games, it lacks personification and fresh personalities even if the game might be enjoyable. While it was quite a safe route to go from, looking at the history of Disney games, it is not a formula that would last long or reflect Square's reputation when they had breakthroughs like Final Fantasy VII. Nomura, to compromise the arguments between Disney about who would be the protagonist, designed his own original character for the game to complement the story he envisioned following Sakaguchi's advice. And from then on, the premieres of Kingdom Hearts is famously labeled a Final Fantasy and Disney collab, which questioned a lot of gamers and journalists. A crossover that didn't even look legitimate. Yes, goofy with normal people, you're gonna see that. That labeling would also influence greatly on the marketing. Though it was perceived as the weirdest by fans, it certainly attracted new gamers and Disney enthusiasts. The Kingdom Hearts announcement trailer was launched at E3 in 2001. It began marketing at that event that even included the game's first main weapon as a gift to participants who watched the presentation. It's got that old edgy logo going with it. The beta trailers with the old logo of Kingdom Hearts wasn't all that widespread, but it came with a similar format that future titles also followed. Shown in it were vague text and, surprisingly, mainly the original characters. Environments of the game would give an idea of what Disney property it was from, but the announcement trailer never continuously shoved a popular Disney character on screen other than Donald and Goofy. Only the later trailers and print ads would they finally use that type of format, and it's interesting how it might have been perceived for the announcement trailer to not show much of these Disney characters. For KH1, the amazing vocal music of Simple and Clean by Utada Hikaru was the main song when it's advertised, a long-living classic for the franchise. Japanese pop music was abnormal in the West, most of them probably came from anime, but Utada Hikaru's song might have helped make the commercials more memorable and catchy due to its rarity. The existing Disney movies that were highly popular and selected for Kingdom Hearts were the 2D Disney films other than Nightmare Before Christmas. Remember that 3D graphics were the era for this stage of gaming. One of the challenges was integrating the Disney films into 3D to fully utilize Sony's PlayStation 2 console and be on par with the recently released Final Fantasy X. And Kingdom Hearts can beneficially utilize the 3D quality to show something new that Disney had not previously done on the factor that you remove Pixar out of the equation, which was 3D animation during the 90s. While the aforementioned Capcom Mickey games had implemented 3D designs, Kingdom Hearts was one of the first for a wide variety of Disney characters to be animated 3-dimensionally before Chicken Little was released, ironically the first 3D Disney film. 3D graphics in Kingdom Hearts gave brand new life to these movies even if the plots were complete rehashes from the 2D design. The environments they built and characters formulated a breadth of new perspective. It wouldn't feel outdated when it immerses you inside an explorable 3D environment. The novelty to possibly explore these Disney worlds and encounter familiar faces. It wouldn't be a pixelated game with platforming tasks like Aladdin. Story elements from the original movies were part of this design, which still holds the original adaptation and doesn't feel repetitive from the movies. Print ads, commercials, and promotional items start to emphasize on both the Disney and Final Fantasy aspect, following Final Fantasy VII's route of show not tell. That itself was adequate to know the idea of Kingdom Hearts while keeping its story mysterious. Showing these 3D graphics of memorable Disney characters was enough for fans to be interested in them, their favorite characters being revived through a video game. Another big appeal in Kingdom Hearts was the Final Fantasy cameos with this new 3D design that predates Advent Children. Final Fantasy fans can also find a purpose of interest with the characters from the franchise in this game. They definitely accentuated the "who you will run into next" tagline. Pretty effective in fact, to show that this is a game that stretches out to many other Disney franchises and doesn't stick to just one. If you're a fan of a character from a particular movie and see that they will have some form of inclusion, it would be interesting enough to try the game out and take 9 Disney titles into one and you'd have a lot of reception. It is without doubt that Disney was Square's crutch to market the game. There were no prequels to make it recognizable or even a big commercial outreach as much as FF7. Commercials played mostly in television shows, cartoon and Disney properties aimed for kids. The House of Mouse, which is the literal embodiment of Kingdom Hearts without the Final Fantasy and original characters, had VHS supplements with trailers for Kingdom Hearts, an odd outlier when the other trailers featured were Disney's future films and not video games. Square had also included bonus discs for Final Fantasy X, which featured trailers for the Final Fantasy movie Spirits Within, interviews with the development team and even Sakaguchi, and a Kingdom Hearts trailer. These were the few ways that marketing outreach was done back in the early 2000s. Plenty of physical mediums, a way with images, words and visuals. On the other hand, there was a contest to name a secret boss in Kingdom Hearts 1 Kurt Zisa, using competitions as marketing mediums. Not to forget the demo discs that were big at the time, remember that? They're basically additional parts to marketing, which is the equivalent to downloading demos digitally today. But we're gonna discuss gameplays and demos later, as we shouldn't forget some ways that Japan did promotional items. They can get very extreme with its marketing and just about fit in any property to be advertised. Whether it's Final Fantasy XIII and Nissan, or Ariana Grande in a mobile game, tie-in campaigns are popular there, even with a couple of Kingdom Hearts promotional items. We've got Kingdom Hearts on the soft drink bottle, much like the previous Final Fantasy VII Pepsi promotion. This one's from Asahi, a local Japanese soft drink producer, which features bottles with the characters from the game, including keychains and bottle caps, pretty much merchandising at this point. Not too far away from the other Final Fantasy tie-in campaigns. And then there were ramen noodles, Kingdom Hearts ramen noodles, putting Kingdom Hearts characters on the noodle cups, and it seems you could receive other merchandise and figurines along with it, now with additional Disney characters featured in the game. It's difficult to gauge success of things like this, but howbeit it will certainly reach a larger demographic with this type of promotion. But if you were to stumble upon these products, most of these marketing tools heavily relied on recognition of Disney characters, along with some of its posters and print media. That's on the external factors, but other than those aspects, Kingdom Hearts also offered a new way of action RPG, something beyond just a Disney collab. Freedom for player movement and developing a playstyle similar to Mario 64 meant that the regular formula of turn-based combat needed to be changed, stepping away from the traditional Final Fantasy. The flash transitions that happens with every enemy encounter could slow the fluidity of the game and limit the player's out-of-battle movements to just walking. So, Kingdom Hearts was developed as an action RPG, inspiring from Square's other titles that share a similar trait. Interactive elements and the freedom in fighting enemies was a significant factor, as other games like Half-Life or Zelda makes movement much more enjoyable. An open environment without much transition breaks. The third-person camera and Final Fantasy magical elements formulate into a combat that is versatile and fun to play. Which comes to the demo disc and demo booths. Back in the day, the main idea for a video game was to make it fun, especially if they are aimed for children. In the combat system of Kingdom Hearts, between the versatile elements, one button can be suitable enough in every aspect of battling. It retains its simplicity with some platforming maneuvers similar to Jak and Daxter, a lock-on feature similar to Link's in Ocarina of Time. In the modern standard, it might feel simplistic and slow, but it achieves its objective for a free-roaming environment, enemies that show up instantly as you explore. Also requiring a smart playstyle now that you can't rely on automatic turn-based combat to reach enemies airborne or the bits of platforming, making this game suitable and familiar for newcomers in the combat and controls. With this style, the demo booths in the old days of E3 and TGS will be easily approached without much information on playing it optimally. It was easy to enjoy when the simplest of gameplay feels satisfying. And we must address these statues near the booths. Nothing attracts you more than a 14-year-old boy with this grin on his face. Combat was a big praise for the game, an action RPG that carries over the Final Fantasy formula. The game focuses on controlling one character without the need to control the other allies, and their actions can be adjusted. It was just the third-person camera in close quarters that journalists find problematic. And even to this day, the games won't allow adjusting the field of view. Cameras getting compressed near walls and enemies blocking your view. But other than those inconveniences, it was perceived very well by the public for Square's new action RPG, revolutionizing combat systems for the JRPG genre. And we've seen Square's part in developing the combat system for the game, but now going back to Disney's contribution. Voice acting was relatively new in video games, even in Final Fantasy, only starting using voices in Final Fantasy X. And without voice acting, there's going to be lots of text boxes. For how Kingdom Hearts' cast call went, Disney provided much of the talent to voice the characters, while Square's main focus was developing the game. Most of the cast from the original movies reprised their roles for Kingdom Hearts. Alice's voice actor, Catherine Beaumont, voicing her character again 50 years later, Scott Weinger reprising his role as Aladdin, mixed with a few exceptions like Hercules' voice actor in Kingdom Hearts being voiced by Sean Astin. As Tate Donovan, the original Hercules wasn't able to reprise his role in KH1, but began to voice him in the subsequent Kingdom Hearts games. And more significantly, it was the first debut voices of some of our popular Final Fantasy characters. They managed to get Mandy Moore to voice Aerith in Kingdom Hearts, but wasn't available for Kingdom Hearts 3's Rapunzel. We also heard Steve Burton's first performance as Cloud Strife, before voicing the character again in Advent Children and Crisis Core. We had Lance Bass for Sephiroth. If you wanna conclude who's the original Sephiroth, it has to be Lance Bass. Leon, obviously from Final Fantasy VIII, and Yuffie, which I only now realized had her own YouTube channel and played Kingdom Hearts while researching this, and she gave us the voice line we needed.
I've heard that the Keyblade can open all sorts of locks. Why is she on the bed like that?
All these Final Fantasy characters that came from memorable games finally had a voice, and the voice actors doing Final Fantasy VII characters reprised their roles from Kingdom Hearts to Advent Children. Apart from Sephiroth, Kingdom Hearts became another basis for voice acting in Square and using the iconic characters from the internationally recognized titles. Both fans of Disney and Final Fantasy will hear their characters speak again, and some would speak for the first time. And this is without even the main original cast of characters in Kingdom Hearts. Haley Joel Osment became the voice of Sora, the main character in the game, who was a big deal back then. A rising star known for his role in The Sixth Sense, and other roles in Disney like Chip the Teacup in Beauty and the Beast. Then we have David Gallagher, known for his role in Seven Heaven that voiced Riku in Kingdom Hearts 1, and still sticking to it for the franchise.
He's just a sexy guy.
Ansem, the main original villain in the game, was played by Billy Zane, known for his character as Caledon Huckley in the Titanic, though he won't continue to the franchise due to conflicts with Disney. While these voice actors were well known, it probably had little impact on the marketing since again, voice acting in video games were quite new. The trailers didn't even emphasize on the casting, just the characters that you'll meet along the way. And Square didn't necessarily need memorable actors to market their niche games, and leading to the premiere of Kingdom Hearts, it looks like their collaboration with Disney along with a new innovative combat system was enough to pay off. Kingdom Hearts' outreach wasn't as complex and detailed as Final Fantasy VII, and probably didn't need to. Square had already established a close relationship with Sony that made their console a competitive player, releasing 4 incredibly successful Final Fantasy titles prior to Kingdom Hearts in the span of just 5 years, making them a staple name in the early days of the PlayStation. Investments in commercials was pretty much thanks to the Disney name, also aiming at mediums targeted for kids. As their target markets are established, the cooperation with Disney and Sony were in order, now it's launching it. Box arts for video games were one of the most important aspects to get someone to pick up a game. If the advertisements had never reached them, they would get their impressions from a cover art when walking into a game store. They're introduced to the name of the game, the developers, and what they could expect. And for how long the franchise had been going, Kingdom Hearts' first box art is a timeless artwork. The logo with the brands of Disney and Square beside each other, the cast of characters that look out at the distance, the antagonist-looking stance of Riku being the only one to look at the opposite direction, Sora, Kairi, Donald, and Goofy looking up to the sky, our main protagonist being center stage with a fully scaled sized Keyblade. Just the mechanisms of their placements were very well detailed. Since Mickey Mouse's character was limited to its use in Cage 1, the iconic character isn't even in the box art, which was the project's original goal of using an icon as popular as Mario to market the game. But fans may remember seeing Donald and Goofy mysteriously there, enough to convince them to try the game out. And can't forget the enormous heart graphic as the background, even when this Kingdom Hearts never showed up in the game, only appearing in Cage 2. These elements make Kingdom Hearts 1's box art one of the most memorable in the franchise, and coming up with this box art was frankly the last thing to do to publish the game. Nomura said in an interview that he worked on it last minute and was very stressed about it. Disney requested a cover art to represent the world of Kingdom Hearts, and Nomura played his cards right. And he was intuitive not to do a collage of all the Disney worlds or characters that would be in the game, just the main characters on this original new adventure. He said, "I think it was the first time in a long time that I had poured so much heart and soul into an artwork." Finally finishing the artwork began the launch of Kingdom Hearts, first in Japan in March 28, 2002, and later in North America on September 17th of the same year, selling more than 5 million copies and went on to achieve Sony's greatest hits, inside the top 10 best-selling games for the top-selling console for the past 2 decades. A game with a strange collaboration that just works. This is Kingdom Hearts. Kingdom Hearts 1 is one of the few instances that the Disney image was prioritized and with a lot of their contributions in marketing. Disney had a pre-launch party with the voice actors and other stars, including Nomura, which was very private since not much information was gotten from it. And I didn't forget Hayden Panettiere, who is the voice of Kairi, was done a little dirty for Kingdom Hearts 3. I know Nomura likes to have same voice actors for counterpart characters, but still. And also, are those shoes with zippers on them? You know what they say about these dedicated developers at Square. Seriously dedicated. Although Kingdom Hearts was unmatched against the Final Fantasy franchise at times, reaching the top 10 best-selling PlayStation 2 game is a commendable achievement. And to think that the Disney label might mean that it will have a simple basic gameplay and storyline like other Disney games, only to come out with an original story that defined video game crossovers. While Disney had outsourced licensing and collaborations to other game companies and find their own success, Kingdom Hearts stayed true with the traditional Disney characters and is recognized as one of the best Disney games without the Marvel or Lucasfilms brands, sprouting a video game franchise that also helped revive classic characters that was very short-lived, like Yen Sid from Fantasia in Cage 2. And optimism grew about Oswald the Lucky Rabbit being in Kingdom Hearts, as he was also one of Tetsuya Nomura's favorite characters. With all the development and narrative choices this game took, Kingdom Hearts 1 is a prime title for Disney's face in the gaming world and Square's approach in the action RPG genre. Coupled with other integral parts of the game, including the soundtrack composed by the ever-talented Yoko Shimomura, its success is in no doubt of creating a large dedicated fanbase across the world, eager to explore what complex story comes next. After Kingdom Hearts 1, while Sony was the primary and essential partnership for Square, there were plans to renew their relationship with Nintendo. Former president of Square Enix, Yoichi Wada, detailed how the Game Boy Advance was another opportunity to publish their games and get a new working relationship with Nintendo. And after Kingdom Hearts 1, many were eager to see a sequel for the original story. Chain of Memories was released on the Game Boy Advance, although I don't think this was heavily influenced by wanting to renew the relationship with Nintendo. Chain of Memories was relatively successful, but not as large as the first game. Disney had a small hand towards marketing it.
Computer, give me the inside info on Disney's newest handheld video games.
Accessing information. Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories is an all-new action-packed adventure.
But the main outcome was probably a strengthened relationship back with Nintendo. The other time that Disney was a huge influence in marketing the franchise was Kingdom Hearts 3. Cage 3 and Cage 1 even share very similar traits in how they were marketed. Cage 3 emphasizing on the Disney worlds and also Pixar this time, parallel to Cage 1's emphasis on Disney characters. And the combat mechanic of attraction flows, which features Disney park rides. Unnecessary gameplay wise. There was a competition in the mobile game Union Cross to get your name into Kingdom Hearts 3, similar to the name in the game contest for the secret boss Kurt Zisa in Kingdom Hearts 1. All of these marketing traits with the exception of Final Fantasy characters in Cage 3. Kingdom Hearts 3 became the new fastest selling game in the franchise, surpassing the previous best selling game, which was Kingdom Hearts 1. And for that game, it is essentially a successful marketing, but I wouldn't call it good marketing. The reveal trailer in 2013, Tetsuya Nomura admitted it was released way too early, and a change in engine in 2014 slowed development down. Including Pixar franchises into the game took some time, and the trailer was released before Frozen or Big Hero 6 was released in theaters, before even the PlayStation 4 was released. If we wanna put it in a more in-depth perspective, there were 3 other Kingdom Hearts titles released in a row for each year leading to 2013. Releasing the trailer in 2013 probably meant the series wanted to follow up with that streak, and potentially making it a PlayStation 4 exclusive as a debut game, or maybe even Cage 3 as a PS3 game. Also, the games were scattered between different consoles and potentially interpreted as irrelevant spin-offs. Therefore came the release of 1.5 and 2.5 remixes, re-releases on the final mixed versions of the game this time, for the PS3 in 2013 and 2014, packaged with additional scenes for Recoded and the 358 over 2 days movie. Only until 2015 when Disney Worlds are being confirmed and Kingdom Hearts 2.8 was to be released. At least there was a brief period of not so bad publicity. And also Roy Conley. As for the Disney properties, the Kingdom Hearts team had the privilege of previewing the Frozen movie that has yet to be released in theaters. This would consequently make the Frozen world have advisory restrictions when it was still very new. Why is perceived as the worst world in Kingdom Hearts 3 with the lack of interaction with the actual characters? And I don't have to explain Cage 3's spoiler trailers. But looking beyond the spoilery of KH3's long stretch of trailers, and with the entire series getting far more accessible, Kingdom Hearts 3's base game is still perceived well for newer players entering the franchise without exposing themselves in all the trailers. And for longtime fans, even after the game had been out for 1 year, its DLC, Remind, was recorded to be the second most downloaded content in January, even at the price of $30, including additional content and bosses for the original story, while also making the most epic Disney moment. It is safe to say that even after a divisive base game, and still divisive, the franchise is here to stay, and it's here if it was not for Kingdom Hearts 1's success. Kingdom Hearts is a special game in this age. Even with Disney princesses and kiddish themes, it never fails to capture a variety of demographics interested in the combat, the Disney franchises, or the 20-year-long story. What created and built Square Enix's 4th best-selling franchise started from the first game and this man. The success that convinced Disney to give more creative control for Square to develop its own story, building a fandom that was once hooked on the Disney aspect, to them scouring every bit of original lore wherever it is, even when Disney had very little contributions to it. Whether you like the franchise or not, its initial success reflects on their groundbreaking development of a game, crafting plots to tie in both Disney and Square, the soundtrack encompassing the brilliant music from Final Fantasy and Disney, showing the potential of collaborations within video games. Knowing its impact on the gaming industry, Disney can see amazing products that can come into fruition when they license to external developers, and Kingdom Hearts was a big stepping stone for them to do it. It will be long revered as an important crossover in gaming and the capabilities of doing so.